I booked my van in for an MOT. I thought I'd best check it over, reverse the van from here to a little bit further down onto the driveway, and I heard this massive crack. So it was either this leaf spring that was fracturing, or the other problem I had, my U-bolt bolt had sheared in half. Both had fresh cracks in them, so they've both been done on the driveway. So it's definitely worth checking out your leaf springs if you've got high mileage vehicles, because you could end up in a bit of a spot of bother, if not with the recovery people, with the coppers. As we found out in the last video, my rear suspension was not in good condition. However, I have bought all the parts needed to do the full suspension upon the van. Also, I'm going to do the full brakes as well, discs and pads. I've just noticed in the middle of the new leaf spring there's a spigot. In the old one it's missing. You may come across that. Just give me a minute. Yep, it was still stuck on the underside mounting point of the axle where the spigot sits within that mounting point. So probably best checking that mounting point on the axle before you fit the new leaf springs. I had to drill mine out with an M8 drill bit, tap it and use an M8 bolt to pull out the old broken spigot that wants to sit in the middle of the leaf spring. The first job I'm going to do is the shackle mounting point. I've had to remove mine from the van because mine, well, I have replaced these bushes before and it's only lasted around about 4 years. So I've removed it from the chassis of the van and cleaned out the bore within this mounting point. Now I've got a nice clean bore upon this mounting point. I'm going to fit the new rubber bushes. Come in a kit like that, pull it apart, take the nylon insert out on each end. I'm going to use some grease that's going to be friendly towards rubber, so it's not going to eat into the rubber. Which one is it? It's the green one. I'm going to lightly lubricate each rubber bush. Put some in there. There you go. Just push it in by hand. If you're using some kind of mechanical force, you know there's something wrong with that ball. You also need cleaning out. Put a bit more rubber friendly grease upon that new bush there. Same again on the other side. Press down. There we have it. Nylon insert within the rubber bush. Same on the other side. Insert that into the rubber bush, and obviously have a metal sleeve with the rest of that grease onto that sleeve, and that would just push in. I have to get an hammer for that one. There we are. And just make sure that bush is nice and flush with the mounting point. So go and fit that onto the chassis of the van. And this just fits onto the chassis just here. 4 10mm bolts, 17mm head, and 4 10mm nuts with 15mm head on each one, and each one of these bolts wants to be initially tightened up to 43 Newton meters, then tightened up again to 53 Newton meters. What I'll probably do throughout this video is placing captions for when these torque settings are due upon the nuts, and it's a case of just tightening the bolts up and making sure that mounting is secure. Anti-roll bar, I didn't show myself removing this from the vehicle in the first video because you may have one fitted in front of the axle or you may have one fitted behind the axle, depending on what model Iveco you have. However, I have replaced my worn anti-roll bar tie bars on each end of the roll bar. These attached to the axle, and to attach it to the chassis of the van, I'm going to replace the rubber bushes as well. Now there is a split within these rubber bushes. It's just a case of pulling it apart and sliding it over and pop the clamp within the rubber bush, like so. And it's just a case of weaving the anti-roll bar over the prop shaft. Just trying to get it into the right position there. And twisted the tie bars out of the way. Mounted the anti-roll bar onto the chassis. Yeah, again 10mm nuts, 2 of 17mm headed bolts, 15mm headed nuts. And once the anti-roll bar has been mounted onto the chassis, on the other end of the anti-roll bar is your tie bars. They want to be located within the mounting points that's on the axle. Align the holes up to allow your M10 bolt to go through, 17mm headed bolt and 15mm headed nut, and tighten those. So coming back to the shackle mounting point again, M16 bolt, just slide that through the shackle mounting point there, that's it. The other side of the shackle bracket on. So we've got 24mm headed bolt and a 24mm headed nut. I'm just going to tighten these up hand tight so at the minute, and I'll come back to tighten those up as and when I get the leaf spring into position. Come back to the front end, M16 bolts yet again, 21mm headed bolt with a 24mm headed nut. Just get this leaf spring lined up so it'll sit within this mounting bracket here. There we are. Took some doing. Yeah, again, I'm not going to tighten these all the way up, I'm just going to make them hand tight. So before I lift my leaf spring into place, I'm just going to put my U-bolts in now so they just hang off the axle like so. So I've just come back to the rear end of the leaf spring to mount it onto the shackle. M16 bolt with 24mm head. Let's get it all lined up, get that bolt pushed through. M16 nut, 24mm headed head. And again on this one, I'm just going to hand tighten the nut and bolt so it's all freely loose like that. So I'm going to go back into the middle of the leaf spring. Right, I've just brought my jack in. I just want to lift up this axle slightly and turn these blocks which this axle is sitting on the other way around. And I'm not going to put my fingers in between it, but in between the leaf spring and the mounting point for the axle is a spriget, and that spriget wants to sit within the hole that's within the underside of the axle mount. So just to line up that spigot that slots into the hole on the underside of that axle, just lubricate it up. The full axle wants to come back this way, so I've got a ratchet strap on it. I'm just going to pull the axle back a bit. In fact, I've probably gone a bit too far. I believe that's in. Yes, that's now in. I wasn't, I pulled on the bloody thing. Just going to pull this ratchet strap out of the way. Now that spriget has found its hole on the axle. Made a mess of my paintwork. There you go, the air gap between the axle and the leaf spring has now closed up since we used the ratchet strap and pulled the full axle forwards. So that means that spriget has now found its hole. I'm just going to go underneath. U-bolts have been applied with some anti-seizing grease or copper grease, and I'm just going to slide them U-bolts through the bottom mounting bracket. Maybe a bit tight. That's gone through. M12 U-bolts with 19mm. Is it 19mm? Yes, a 19mm nut on each of the U-bolts. Right, so once you get all these nuts tightened up on these U-bolts, you're going to have a lot of thread on each of these U-bolts that will need eventually cutting off with the angle grinder, the cutting disc. Next stage, shock absorber. Use shock absorber. I'm just going to prime up a few times before I fit it. Just in case of pulling it out and pushing it back in again. Just making sure there's no leaks on the new unit itself. There you go. Grab my bolts and go and fit this. Okay, we can slide it into its top mounting point. Make sure that mounting point is in good condition, because I have known them to crack or corrode away before. M16 bolt, yet again, for the top. 24 headed bolt with a 24mm headed nut. I'm just going to hand tighten them up. Just pull out the shock out a bit. There you go. Long M16 bolt with washer on one side. Just push the bolt through. There's a thick washer that goes between the shocker and its mounting point, and just slide that through its hole. Washer on the other side of that M16 bolt, 24mm headed bolt, 24mm headed nut, yet again. And just screw on that nut there. Now I can tighten up the shocker. Now, having built up the rear suspension, after fitting new parts, I can go around each individual nuts and bolts tighten up to the required torque settings that's been set out in the Iveco engineer service book. So after checking all the torque settings upon the rear suspension, I then moved on to the U-bolts, where I cut off the excessive amount of thread on the underside of the axle. Then I moved on to the rear dodgy blocks, where I removed those from underneath the chassis to stop it flexing. I then removed the large cribbing block which the van had its entire weight upon whilst doing the rear springs. I did mention that in the first video, if you care to watch that, to learn about cribbing blocks. Each cribbing block does have a safe working load embossed upon it. If the weight is distributed equally across those blocks and used in multiple, it can definitely take the weight of the van. Lifted the van up in the air and removed all the blocks that was underneath the van. Then I jumped into the van, reversed it off the driveway, to this position here, where I shall be fitting the front Transverse Leaf Spring in the next video. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.